Hello, everyone. So we are now at the top of the hour, but there are still people signing into the webinar. So let's just give them one more minute and then we can get started. So thank you, everybody, for your patience. Okay, so I think let's get started. So once again, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar organized by InsightivWork and Curo Compensation. My name is Jaslyn Koh, Director of InsightivWork based in Singapore. I am your local host for the APAC webinar. With me today is Ruth Thomas. She's the Senior Consultant and Industry Principal from CuroCom. Ruth is based in London. So this is actually our fourth webinar in our collaboration with Curo in Asia Pacific. And this is also going to be the last webinar for this year. And for the last 4 months, we have actually covered a wide array of compensation topics and sharing that with all the audience here in APAC. So today's sessions, we are going to focus on why is commuting pay so hard, and which is also becoming a very important topic, on everybody's table as well, as we approach, your preparation for the next annual comp cycle. So definitely this topic will be of interest to you. But before we get into the presentation, a very quick introduction of who we are. So let me first introduce Ruth Thomas. Ruth is the principal consultant at Curo Compensation. She also co-founded the company 8 years ago after spending 20 years as a HR and reward professional. As a thought leader, she gets to influence Curo's product portfolio and client solutions based on market trends. Ruth has the opportunity to live and work in Hong Kong for 4 years and in Singapore for 3 years before she returns to London in year 2001. So let us hear more about CuroCom from Ruth. Ruth, please.
Hi, hello everybody, and thanks for joining the webinar. So just a quick introduction to Curo, for those of you who don't know who we are. So we're an HR technology provider, but we specialise in compensation management SaaS solutions. So we work with many leading companies around the world who leverage our technology to help them drive business performance and employee engagement and focus on optimizing their compensation spend. So we work with over 230 clients across many countries and geographies. And we have 3 products that we bring to market. Curo Enterprise is our kind of main product. It's been the one that we founded the company with. It's a compensation planning tool. That is for sort of all types of organisations who wish to conduct pay allocation processes either annually or more frequently, including sort of all year round. And in the last 3 years, we've been focusing on our pay equity practice. In the UK, where I'm based, we brought out a specific product called gender pay gap reporting, which is designed for companies who need to comply with the UK legislation on gender pay gap reporting. And now we're currently, just this year, we've been focusing on the development and release of our new product, Pay Equity Tracker, which is a self-service solution designed for companies to do global pay equity analysis within their organisations. And we will be finally formally launching that product at the end of this month. We work with many companies, as we said, many leading companies around the world. You can see some of the names focused there. And also we work with many partners who help us to distribute our products, or we provide complementary products through our client base. And if you'd like to find any more about any of those, you can obviously visit our website or get in touch with us. Back to you, Jesslyn.
Thank you. So I am the founder of InsightivWork based in Singapore and had more than 20 years as a total reward practitioner. I have the opportunity to manage reward at the geographical and business unit level. I'm a firm believer of bringing simplification to think the difference in comp solutions, and most passionate about integrating workplace culture and employee experience in strategic total reward management. So just a brief about what is InsightivWork. So we are a independent management and total rewards consulting firm in Singapore, and also serving the HR professionals in Asia Pacific as well. Our mission is to do great works with HR, to partner and to journey with you in your total rewards matters. We bring our human expertise and also our smart tech solution to help you make insightful decisions to do the real compensation work. So with that, we can move on to our agenda for today. So Ruth will take us through this 30-minute webinar, and we will have the Q&A session at the end. All of you are muted on this session. We can submit, you can submit a question at any time using the question box, and we will pick this up at the end unless you have a technical problem. If you don't want to ask your question now, you can also contact us after the webinar via the email that we provided, and we will be happy to further our discussion with you. And finally, this session is recorded, so you will be provided a link to this recording and a PDF of this material. So I'm going to hand the time over to you, Ruth.
Great, thanks Justin for that introduction. Okay, so we're going to talk about communication and why sometimes communicating pay can be so hard. And I know from my own experience as being a compensation and reward manager for a long time, it's a part of the process that normally once you've been through the whole compensation review process, it's kind of often forgotten about, or you're kind of so tired by that stage that trying to focus on getting the right communication process is hard. And working with clients over the last 8 years, this is also the one part of the compensation cycle where you hear some of the most horror stories about things going wrong. So I think it's a good time right now for us to come together to just think about, why is it so hard? What are the issues? And how might you go about this process in a better way within your own organizations? So we do find it hard. We do find communicating pay hard. I think firstly, it's because ultimately pay is money, and people don't generally like talking about money. It's an uncomfortable subject. We don't often, talk to our friends and family about how much we earn. So if we're kind of uncomfortable talking with our nearest and dearest, you can also understand why we feel uncomfortable talking about it in the workplace. And there are also a number of reasons why pay conversations are uncomfortable. I think firstly, pay has very personal implications for employees because it impacts their livelihood and lifestyle. And although the debate is currently out about how much of a motivator pay on its own is, we know that it's still a fundamental bedrock in that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and the need to get pay right first before you focus on more extrinsic employee needs. And I also think that to some degree, pay also quantifies worth, as rate of pay is determined by the skills and experience an employee brings to the table. So that kind of represents how much you value them. And because of the sort of long link between pay and performance, I also think pay is intrinsically linked to how you perform as an employee, and that's quite a sensitive subject as well. Sometimes your own views of how you perform may be very different from your employer. I don't think there's anyone that would ever admit that they are a poor performer. And I think generally just, more recently in society, we've seen a lot of focus now on pay disparities. And after a prolonged period of restrained wage growth, there is a lot of growing sensitivity around wealth distribution in our societies, with headlines focusing on CEO pay and the move towards public reporting of CEO pay ratios, which is legislation we have coming in the UK. There's still some discomfort generally around who is paid what. Okay. So also from a manager's perspective, we rely on them to communicate pay. So I'd also kind of like to think about it from their perspective. And it's often an uncomfortable subject for them as well. From a strategic perspective, pay is essentially just like any other expense or cost, an investment from our businesses to drive productivity. But because it's personal to people, and for all the reasons I've just mentioned, it is an awkward subject for managers to talk about too. And managers are kind of caught in the middle of HR and employees. They have to follow strict guidelines regarding pay that we give to them, but they also want to keep their teams happy and engaged. And most managers are often unprepared for the discussions around communication. Often in Reward, we think we've done our job if we sent them a nice policy or briefing document, but we don't always prepare them for those difficult conversations, and especially for pushback from employees. I don't know whether there's anything you wanted to add there, Jocelyn, from your experience of how managers feel about communicating pay.
Well, I can completely understand some of this awkwardness. I think it didn't help if managers are not personally involved in the final pay decision, yet they are expected to communicate pay to employees. Well, I think regardless of your company's policies or manager's perspective, I would like to say, unfortunately, communicating pay is still a part of managers' responsibility. So I think Ruth will have more to cover on how we can help managers overcome these challenges.
Yeah, great, thanks. Well, I think, I mentioned it at the top of the session, we've all probably, as practitioners, got some toe curling examples of bad pay communication. I'm just going to put up all my images here. Oh, sorry, went too fast there. I mean, these are some ones that I have actually heard of, where we've just sort of seen managers scribbling a number on a piece of paper and sliding it across the table. The kind of classic manager, I wanted to give you more, but my hands were tied. Or the kind of, we've all got 3%, but go and talk to HR about your problems. And probably one of the most common sort of occurrences you have is kind of just avoiding the conversation altogether and leaving it for employees to find out on their paycheck what their actual pay changes or communication or compensation changes have been. I don't know if you've got any of your own personal examples, Jocelyn, of bad communication examples.
Well, I actually have two. So I actually encountered some managers, right? They would just simply email the pay and the bonus payout to employee without even a proper dialogue. So I do see some of this, perhaps maybe because managers and employees are seated virtually. They work remotely. There are also cases whereby managers have, a large number of direct reports that they just have no time. But if we agree that pay is an emotional topic and employees are not just another widget in a company, we got to have a more human way of having a conversation. And the second incident that I remembered was I was asked by a HR business partner to help write a script for a senior leader so that he can have a proper dialogue with the direct reports. So you think about this, right? Even for the greatest managers in the world, this conversation can throw awkwardness for them. So if company wants to rely on managers to deliver pay messages to employees, I think we've got to prepare them to enable them. Yeah.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Well, we support communications through our technology here at Curo, through our enterprise planning product. And one of the reasons people often laughed when we show them this screen, which is kind of the manager's access, where they can email a letter to an employee through the system, and we do prompt them to say, can you please confirm that you have had a conversation with the employees. People often laugh to say, do you really need that? But I think from my own experience, we kind of do feel that we need it. Okay, so there's some of the problems. I also wanted to share with you some useful survey evidence that highlights some of the compelling issues that often result from poor communication. I've got sort of 4 snapshots of different survey evidence. The first one is from Glassdoor's survey back in 2015. It was a survey on global salary transparency, and it covered employees across 7 countries, mainly in the US, North America, and Europe. But it highlighted that many employees don't understand how their pay is determined, and a whopping 69% wished that they had a better understanding of what fair pay is for their position and skill set at their company and in their local market. So generally, they're kind of showing, that people want a much better understanding of why they're paid what they're paid. And, that's probably because of this next snapshot that I'm sharing you. This has been one of my kind of favorite surveys. I've often referred to it. Again, it's back from 2015. It's based on a pay scale survey. It was published in the Harvard Business Review, but it was really interesting. It talked about this gap in employee perception between how they believe they're paid relative to the market. And you can see we've got three buckets of people here. We've got people who were paid above market in the top line, people who were paid at market, and people who were paid below market. And then you can see how each of those different groups felt they were paid relative to the market. So if we look, we start at the bottom, we've got people who are paid below market, and yes, 83% of those concurred that, you know, they were paid below market. Then it starts to get interesting when you go up to the next level and you look at people paid at market, and 64% of them still believe that they were paid below market. And then even when you get to the people who were paid above market, you've still got 35% who believe they were paid below market and 45% at market. And I guess it's really kind of, you know, highlighting that gap in perception of how people feel they're paid relative to how they're actually paid. And if you're not communicating to employees effectively, then they will come up with their own perceptions of how pay is determined or benchmarked, and often that will be wrong or incorrect. The other area that we are, you know, focusing on today is from an HR and reward perspective. When it comes to communication, you know, we often worry about managers' capabilities. And again, I'm referencing this is a really good report from PayScale on compensation best practices. And this highlights concerns around poor line management capability when it comes to communicating pay. And it showed that there's a gap in perception that managers have of their own ability to explain the rationale behind pay increases versus HR's perception of managers' abilities. So there's a big gap there you can see between managers highly confident and HR less confident about how they're, you know, actually communicating. So we've got a 50% confidence gap. That's a big disconnect, and I think that's going on in a lot of organisations, and it's something that needs to be addressed. And I think this final study that I'm just sharing a snapshot for you from the World at Work 2018 study of reward fairness and equity. And this really highlights how important communication is when it comes to employee perceptions of reward fairness. And you can see here communication features almost equally at the top here, both in terms of, you know, things organisations do well to improve perceptions of reward fairness and things that it doesn't do so well. And it's actually the results come out fairly similar. So it's probably highlighting that there's a lot of good and poor practice going on out there. So reviewing this survey evidence, it's clearly important that we get pay communication right. You can have a really great pay strategy with accurate benchmarking, well-defined pay structures, but if that's not communicated to the stakeholders, it may not be successful. So I think if you've been on some of the previous webinars, I have talked about pay brand. I'm quite interested in this concept. For me, you know, pay brand is an integral part of your EVP. So when you're thinking about communicating pay within your own organization, you do need to think about what are you trying to say about pay and how it supports the culture and objectives of your organization. And when people say to me, what do you really mean by pay brand? I kind of say, well, if you were asked at a party, you know, how does your organization pay? Or an applicant asks a current employee, what they say in response is probably, you know, how people perceive your pay brand. But, you know, there is a bit of marketing insight we can gain here because, you know, it is very much really a form of brand communication that we need to think about. And it's about, you know, getting buy-in from all the different stakeholders in order to articulate your overall pay brand. But the big problem, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is the fact that communicating pay is quite complex. There is often, you know, a complex set of calculations or benchmarking and calibration that has resulted in the exact amount that an employee is paid, and that may be hard for managers and employees to understand. I don't know whether you wanted to add a comment there, Jocelyn.
You know, I was looking at this slide and it kind of blew out my face, right? And like, wow, there's so much science behind compensation, managing compensation, but yet it requires a very delicate art to communicating pay. So it brings you into two different spheres, right? And I think that it didn't help when we asked managers to communicate pay jargons to employees. So I think there may be, yes, there are a lot of technicalities involved in a pay decision, but when it comes to pay communication, we need to design the messaging appropriately so that it can be understood by employees. And I think, Ruth, you're going to tell us more about how to come up with, how to look into effective communication.
Yes, so Jocelyn and I were talking about this. We kind of came up with our 5 steps to effective communication, and I'm going to unpack these with you now. But it's about focusing on what your key messages are and determining communication objectives, looking at your audience groups, deciding who's going to do the communicating, selecting the best methods for communication, and measuring your progress at the end of that. So setting objectives, this kind of, there's the obvious one. We obviously want employees to understand the pay decisions that affect them. We want them to stay with our organisation. We want to retain them. And we obviously want to make sure that we engage and motivate them to perform better. So I think we're all probably on the same page when it comes to saying what is the objective of good compensation communication. I think maybe what we don't always do is set some measures and actually track back to those measures to establish whether that objective has been achieved. And I put up a few company examples of the types of measures that people have used in their communication programs to see whether they've been effective. So things like during an exit interview, our employees not mentioning reward, or during a feedback survey post the compensation review, do we see employees saying, yes, I understand how my pay is determined? Are you monitoring, for example, applicants for reasons they turn down roles, and is that due to compensation? So you can probably think of some good examples in your own organisation about the type of data that you could collect to see whether you're actually achieving on this overarching objective of communicating well to employees. The second step that I mentioned is kind of knowing your audience, and there is a lot of diversity in the workplace now. We have generational differences, we have cultural differences, we have geographic differences, and you may have very different types of employees working within your own organisation. So Justin and I were talking about this, and these are kind of just 3 examples to give you practically about why you might need to think about communicating differently in different types of environments. So my first example is if you think about employees working within a national cafe or food service that has many outlets around the country, and with employees working on shift in stores on fixed pay rates, they're not at their desks and they don't have access to PCs. So communicating to those employees consistently, particularly where pay is often determined by an hourly rate, and pay progression is really important. It's how do you reach out to that type of population who are highly mobile, but also kind of very busy, and they're not really at their desks much during their working day. I think you were going to pick up the next example, Jocelyn, weren't you?
Yeah, and if we think about employees, working in a global company where they have many offices internationally, you have employees managers where they sit on the same site, but you also have managers and employees who work remotely as well, different employee groups with different career structures. So that's just another dimension of, another set of audience that you have to consider.
And then our last example is, we take the typical manufacturing plant where pay is often determined by sort of collective bargaining agreements, very fixed pay arrangements. Many of those employees may work shifts and they don't have access to PCs in their workday. So, thinking about how you reach out to them and communicate consistently is also a challenge.
Yeah, and Ruth and myself, we talk about this, and we are in agreement that even in one organizations, you can't prescribe one specific approach because of the cultural differences, different managers and personality. So what is really clear for both of us is that isn't really a one size all approach that's going to work. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Jocelyn. So I think the next step is then kind of deciding who are you going to rely on to do the communication in your organisation. And we like to talk about there being different actors in the process. And I think it's useful to think about having people with different roles in the communication process. So who are you going to use to introduce messages, and who should reinforce those messages? And we tend to recommend that it's your trusted source that leads the communication. They do the initial delivery. So that may be your CEO or particular business leaders. And they can, introduce the firm-wide strategy and compensation goals. And we also see that particularly working well in some of our client companies when they're using like videos to communicate that, because it gets a consistent message out to everybody, kind of framing the process. Then you need to use your line managers or your face-to-face managers to reinforce that messaging and prepare them to link communication to individual employees, reiterate the decision-making process so they don't want to contradict it. You want them to align with the key messages that your trusted source has communicated, and be there to respond to employee concerns and escalate any questions that they may have. And I'm going to come back to you about how you can prepare managers for that. Now, in today's technology world, we have lots of different options when it comes to communication. I mean, when probably if I wind the clock back 15 years, it was all down to paper-based communication. And I spent kind of a fretful weekend before producing 23,000 compensation statements for employees around the globe in my kind of last role in an investment bank. But today, we do have the benefit of technology and the ability to deliver messages in many different ways. So you can be creative. You don't necessarily just have to choose the written word. And, you can obviously give employees a printed letter, but you can also now give them access to electronic access to their statements, as well as delivering communication, more general communication about how the process is run and where we're at in terms of the overall distribution of budgets. So it's useful to kind of think about your audience, think about how they can access information at what time, and make it all interesting and engaging. So the fifth step in our 5-step process, so we mentioned objectives at the beginning, so back to where we started. How are you going to measure your success in this communication process? So, I mean, there are, again, lots of different sources for this. I know, some of our clients will do post-review surveys. More and more people now are obviously using real-time pulse surveys to capture employee feedback. So focusing a pulse survey around compensation. We get a lot of good feedback when we work with our clients post the compensation review to how managers and employees have felt during the process, and that helps us to sort of realign the process and how they're deploying our technology for future compensation processes. But there are other methods. You can do focus groups. You could pick out particular employees to do one-on-one interviews. Obviously, try and make sure that you've got access to exit interview data to look at the impact of compensation through that process. And as I said, also, during the hiring process, so that joining and end of employee life cycle are really important moments that matter when it comes to capturing information about compensation. So we've talked, just going to finish now, really talk about training managers. Managers really do have a critical role to play in this process, and they need to deliver messages to employees. So we need to get them ready for this process. So we need to get them ready to talk about what and why they need to communicate. Now, most often we kind of just focus on telling them the first part of this slide, really, the context of how we've got to the pay decisions. What we don't often prepare them for necessarily is some of the harder parts of the communication process. And I don't know if you wanted to add a comment there, Jaslyn.
Well, I think managers sometimes they feel they are not so prepared for discussion about pay, and that is when they feel that they have a responsibility to have all the answers. So I think tough questions will obviously need answers or thoughts that needs further consideration. So I think there's a need for us to empower, our managers to call for a follow-up conversation, and especially when these are these are difficult questions, and they need to rely on, and they may need to rely on perhaps like HR, maybe com partners for further guidance. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So these are some of the things to think about. You know, if you're looking at creating a compensation script or a compensation strategy as you go into this review. And we put together some kind of key tips. Now, just a reminder for those of you who may have joined late, you will get access to the recording of this session and the deck that we're sharing. So you'll be able to spend, have a little bit more time focusing on the contents of this slide. But we kind of put together, some of the do's from our experience and some of the don'ts when it comes to getting managers ready. And it is very much, don't just give them a briefing sheet. Make sure that they're ready for pushback. Make sure that they are ready for the good and the bad scenarios. Obviously, one of the most common sort of issues you hear is about managers sort of failing to take ownership of the pay decisions. So, you want to ensure that, they are supporting the decision-making process and keeping their comments on the pay system neutral. And, again, on the don't side, just some of them are relatively obvious points, but worth making to managers as you prepare them for this process. And, as you prepare, sorry, excuse me, there are this is kind of quite documented in a lot of studies on employees' perceptions of pay are, always think that there are 3 key things that employees want to know about their pay. They want to know how it was determined. So, how did you come up with that particular pay increase? How can I influence my pay? What can I do to increase my pay? And also this critical fairness aspect, which I've talked about a lot, is, how does my pay compare to others? So if you're looking at a script for a conversation for an employee, you need to make sure that you connect to those 3 key touch points. And we kind of put up a few typical employee questions to get prepared for, but and I'm sure you can come up with many ones that are relevant to you and your organization. But even that's a good exercise to do at the beginning of the process as you prepare yourself for a communication strategy, is to brainstorm and ask input on that from managers. Are kind of like, what would all be the really difficult questions that my employees might ask in this process, and make sure you've kind of got sort of answers to all of those. So communication, obviously some key tips here. Just remember that it always needs to be 2-way. So you do need to allow for a feedback mechanism of part of the process, both for line managers who you're tasking to do communication and for employees. Why don't you ask your managers to feel whether they were able to address the key talent issues that you were asking them to tackle during the review process? And then, did employees feel rewarded for their effort? Did they understand why they'd received the awards that they did? And increasingly in our agile world, and in the agile business world, more organizations are looking at making this more than once a year event. And we are seeing more organizations moving towards more continuous performance and real-time reward. But pay, like performance, doesn't just have to be a once a year conversation. Personalize where possible. We've talked about diversity within our organizations, but as far as you can, personalize communications so that employees can really connect with the messages that you're delivering to them. And also, how much you communicate in terms of how their pay is determined. We spoke in our last session about pay transparency, will be driven by the level of pay transparency that you have going on in your organization, and that fits with your culture. But increasingly pay transparency and is becoming important. If you were on the last session that we had, so looking at that continuum and finding out what fits for your organization. And I think we're just coming down to the last couple of slides. So why is it important? Well, back to that pay scale 2018 compensation best practices report, they report that top performing organizations do really well at this. So they are more likely to trust their managers. 67% of top performing organizations are confident or very confident in their managers' abilities to have tough conversations around pay. I'm not sure I've always felt that in my career as a reward practitioner. And top performing organizations are more likely to train managers to talk about pay. And also they have greater aspirations for pay transparency in their organisation. So 60% of top performing companies compared to 56% of typical companies. So, you know, interesting benchmark. But I do think, you know, we do see this trend in top performing companies that they generally are better at this process. So little takeaways, I'm going to put them all up. You know, have a look at how your last year's communication went before you go into the next round. Think about overall how you might want to articulate your pay brand. Think about setting those objectives, measures. You know, how are you going to be able to measure what you're trying to achieve through this communication process? Think about who needs to be communicated by whom, and how then you're going to prepare those different actors in the process. And obviously, you know, we're a technology company. Think about how technology can help you in this process. You know, most providers now will provide you with the ability to do electronic communications, and give employees access to communication statements as well. So we have just released some new functionality in the enterprise product around self-service letters. So we've been producing compensation communications for clients for the last 7 or 8 years, but we now just brought out some new functionality that allows our clients to have greater control over the whole letter production process within our solution. And we create some great statements that are all, you know, branded, highly personalized to organizations, but clients have much greater ownership over the configuration, and it's fully integrated into the data that we're holding on the whole compensation review process. So if you're interested in finding out how Curo can help with your communication process, then do get in touch, and we can, you know, provide you with some more information around that. Okay, so that's the end of the content that we wanted to provide today. Thanks very much for all of you for joining. We're going to just open the floor to some questions now, see whether there's anything any specific that you would like to ask us now. If you don't want to ask questions now, again, get back in touch, Jocelyn and I, after the session. We will be sharing the recording and the deck, and always happy to continue the conversation with you. So I'm going to just turn to John, who's supporting Jocelyn and I today, to see if there are any questions that he's seeing come in. Yes. on the Q&A.
Yes, we did have a couple come through. One interesting question: is there such a thing as too much communication or too much transparency?
Well, that is an interesting question. Well, again, I think really how transparent you are in terms of how someone's pay is determined, how much market data you share, how much pay range data you share, how much peer data you share, will be very much driven by your company's culture. We talked in our last webinar, you know, about companies that have a complete open salaries approach, where they know what everybody is paid in the organization, and then kind of at the other extreme, organizations that are highly secretive still about pay. So, you know, that aspect of, can you communicate too much? You need to find the right balance point for your organization. But, you know, when you do find that balance point, it's about getting that communication right. I don't know what you think about that, Jocelyn, on that particular question.
Yeah, so yeah, this is really a good question. So my thought is this, right? I think it's always good to over prepare, so that, you know, when you leave it with the managers, you have them to understand. End of the day, the managers are the one that's going to have a conversation with the employee, and you can leave that with the managers. You know, in the conversation, what sort of information they're going to pull out, what sort of talking point, you know, that they're going to bring across to the employee in the conversation. So I think from my perspective, I always felt that it's always good to over prepare it, so that we prepare our managers to give them enough for them to have a proper conversation. In terms of transparency, in our last webinar, we talked about this. I think the goal about transparency, it's not the goal. The goal for us is how we're going to pay employee, you know, in all fairness, and also, you know, making sure that it is an equitable decision. I think that was the aim about transparency.
Yeah, thanks. Any more questions, John?
Yes, got a couple more. You talked about factoring in communicating to different generations in the employee base. How can you do that in reality?
Well, I think it's definitely, you know, we talked about considering your audience and looking at, you know, the different types of employees, and one aspect of that is if different generations. I think using technology now is a great leveler in that field. So a lot of organisations now providing employees with the ability to log in to a portal where they can not only access compensation statements but interact with that information to sort of really try and drill down and understand how their pay has been determined or how their pay is made up. You know, there are some more, when we work with some younger companies, maybe sort of in some of the more sort of media-based sectors, and they do this kind of really well. They do think about targeting communications to you know, to their potentially younger workforce. You know, how are you going to communicate to your Gen Z and millennial workforce? I don't see many organisations, I don't know whether you do, Justin, who do a completely segmented approach when it comes to pay communications for different generations. I think they kind of factor in the different you know, employee bases that they have and try and get an overall strategy that will cover all populations.
No, I agree with you, Ruth. I think we mentioned in one of the slides that you really cannot have a one size fits all. But at the same time, you know, with all these, you know, culture differences, generation differences, you know, different managers with different personalities and employees, etc., and etc. I think some of this is really got to be situational.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think, and also I think it helps for managers to know who they're talking to, right? As an employee, do they have, you know, a good conversation? Do they understand their employee? And I think managers need to be prepared when they come into the conversation. You can't expect to just rely on you know, the FAQ document and bring it to the conversation, and from there you decide which pointer you want to bring it up. Managers got to be prepared for it when they go into that dialogue with employee.
Great. Any more questions before we sign off here today, John?
Yep. Just one more. How do you manage around some managers will be good at communicating and some not so much?
Well, I know this is quite dear to your heart, Justin. Well, I think hopefully we've covered that in the session today. You know, it's being prepared, I think, is the important, preparing them for the difficult conversations and not just the easy conversations. And you know, that I think will be a great enabler in making sure that, you know, all managers are well prepared to communicate. But you've been thinking about this as well, Jocelyn, haven't you?
Yeah, and I think that you're right. Some managers can communicate well, and some they don't, and some doesn't even know how to communicate. But end of the day, it's going to come back to the managers, because if employees doesn't get their question answered, they will be asking, right? They'll be asking HR. They will be, you know, asking maybe to the next level manager, whatever. So it will come back to the manager in any way. There's no way that you can hide.
Great. Okay, well, I think we're coming to the end of our time today there. So thank you all very much for joining our session today. Again, you know, if you want to get in touch, you know, you've got lots of ways of reaching out to us. That's the last of our current series. We've had 4 great webinars and had over 200 or so people attend those webinars. If you've got ideas of what you would like us to cover next, we're going to plan a new series in the new year. Then, you know, do get in touch with us, and some issues that, you know, you may be finding a challenge that you'd like us to talk about. We'd love to hear your suggestions. But thank you very much, all of you, if you've attended more than one session. An even bigger thank you. We've really enjoyed having you with us, Jocelyn, and I have really enjoyed the sessions. It's been great working with you on this, Jocelyn.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you everyone for supporting us. We see a lot of names that has, you know, come back to our webinar again and again. So that tells us that we have good content for you. So we're looking forward to, you know, speaking to you very, very soon. Thank you, everybody, and have a great week.
Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.